Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Shifting Cybersecurity from a Compliance to a Risk Focus. My name is Stephanie Fung, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be approximately 50 minutes with 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them through the Q&A panel in your Zoom console. This session will be recorded, and all attendees will receive a copy of the slide deck and recording through email. And finally, this session has been approved for 1 CPE credit. To receive your certificate, please ensure that you respond to all 3 polling questions during the session. The polls will automatically pop up in your webinar console, and you can choose your response. Your CPE certificate will be emailed to you within 1 week. Now let me introduce you to our speakers today. Nick Frost has over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity. Prior to co-founding the Cyber Risk Management Group, he held leadership roles at PwC as well as the Information Security Forum. Nick has vast experience designing and implementing pragmatic risk-based solutions, placing him as a leading expert in the field. And joining him is Greg Slayton, CISSP, and client partner at Galvanize. Greg is a strategic resource who helps organizations align their technology to reduce cyber risk and improve efficiencies. Prior to Galvanize, Greg was the Information Security Officer at a government healthcare accounting firm where he led infrastructure, security, and compliance initiatives. And with that, I'll pass things over to Nick to start the presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay, so hello everybody, welcome, and thank you all for logging in and listening to this presentation that Greg and I will walk you through. One of the key objectives that I want to be able to achieve here is to give you, if you like, an industry view from our experience working in cybersecurity and cyber risk management, and give you some hints and tips, help you understand how we see organizations, shifting over to a much more risk-focused approach to their cybersecurity program. So there are a number of areas we're going to cover, and we're going to take a trip down memory lane and look at how that cyber threat landscape has changed. We're going to take a much more business view then around, what cybersecurity and cyber risk management means to the business. And then we're going to take a deep dive into looking at, what good looks like. What are we seeing that are sort of key success factors for organizations that have achieved, a leading cyber risk management capability? And then we're going to start to take a look at this automation topic. It's really, really important, I think, for looking into the future and future-proofing your cyber risk management capability, because, there is a lot of very rich sources of data out there that can really help us understand and apply cyber risk management principles more effectively. And then we'll finish off with a Q&A. So, okay, so let's start off with taking a look at how the cyber threat landscape, has changed, and also how it's likely to change into the future. And it's a key part in terms of being able to appreciate why a risk-based approach for cybersecurity is becoming much more important. If we think back over 30 years now, a lot of those attacks were tended to be driven by notoriety. There wasn't really any financial gain that people could achieve. And a lot of the attacks were fairly low profile. And I think what was fundamental back then, of course, was we were, significantly less dependent on technology to drive our organizations and of course, our own lives. But what we started to see towards 2000 were a number of attacks. In particular, I remember, the I Love You virus, we had Code Red. And this is where we started to see, attention from the media. It became a media hot topic to report on. And we started to see a number of, I suppose you could say, red flags that were being raised by organizations. Because ultimately we all started to become far more dependent on technology in our lives and our working lives. And so there was an element of exposure that was being seen. And of course, since then, we've seen a number of financially driven attacks and, by organized criminal gangs. And of course, that information and the profits made feed back into designing new and more sophisticated attacks. And largely since then, cybersecurity, we had observed was quite compliance driven. And we'll talk about what that actually means. But it wasn't really sufficient for being able to protect organizations against, this evolving threat landscape. And of course, we don't see any change. Of course, we see, new technology coming on board, which is, providing much more target-rich environment, if you like, for those, those adversarial attackers looking to, to exploit data that could be, has a financial value attached to it or disrupt operations for key organizations. And if you only just take a number of, your manufacturers, for example, a lot of the, products, let's say the white goods that we have in our houses today, a lot of these are Wi-Fi enabled, and there's some real big concerns there about, what happens if you have a mass exploit that takes down, your sort of refrigerators, if you like, or your self-driving cars. So there are some real concerns that are growing in this cybersecurity landscape. The plus side of this new technology, of course, is it's making our lives easier, greater, efficiencies, and of course, greater sets of data that unfortunately, are starting to travel over infrastructure that may not have really been prepared and developed with this amount of data transfer in mind. But there are a number of key positives that we're seeing here, and in particular, a number of regulations that we're seeing all around the world that are changing and becoming really quite explicit about the need for organizations to adopt a risk-based approach for their cybersecurity programs. And if you look at some of these regulations, the DFS for New York, it's very, it's very detailed in terms of what the risk expectations are, what the risk guidance is to achieve an understanding of that risk profile and ideas for mitigating it. So, so there's some real positives that are sort of we're starting to see at CRMG and at Galvanize in terms of this evolution for a risk-based approach to be adopted in organizations. And I think the other positive note here, of course, is, a lot of the GRC products that we're seeing out there now can utilize and aggregate a lot of this rich source of data that's being generated by technology and by these security systems. And hopefully we'll get to a point where we almost get to a real-time view of cyber risk by utilizing, sources of threat intelligence, collecting information about vulnerabilities, and generally giving us a much quicker and much more objective view about the cyber risk landscape for our organization. Greg.
Great, thank you, Nick. Yeah, thank you, Nick. That's great. Thank you so much for that. I think this is a great place to introduce our first poll question. Remember, for those who are interested in CPE, make sure to respond to each of the 3 questions during the webinar. I'll say that first off. The first question is this: what is your organization's top cyber risk? And you'll see this poll question pop up to each of you. Is it international or intentional insider attacks, intentional outsider attacks, examples, DDoS or targeted malware, accidental insider events, phishing, accidental data sharing, environmental events, things like COVID, pandemic, flooding? If you could just please respond to that question.
I'm just seeing that some people are having a bit of trouble accessing the polls. So for everyone on the line, if you're joining with a web browser, please ensure that your pop-ups are enabled and refresh the webinar. But in the meantime, feel free to send us your answer through the Q&A panel, and we will log it there. So what I'll do is I'll just end the poll now and show the results. But unfortunately, not many people have been able to respond. But we've already got some clear trends here.
Okay, great. Yeah, it looks like from what we're seeing right now, the clear trend is number one is the intentional insider attacks is running at 83% right now. So thank you for that. It looks like many are responding in the Q&A as well. So thank you for responding there. Again, we'll get that taken care of. So I think, Nick, to continue on, what trends have you observed actually in the industry, say over the past 5 years? Let's discuss that.
Yeah, I think, well, a number of trends. I think the key one here that we're seeing is very much aligned to, you know, the C-level executive. Now they really they really understand cyber risk, and in particular, and this was something that, you know, I recall, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, organizations struggling to get traction with senior leadership to appreciate the importance of cybersecurity. That doesn't seem to be, in general, I'm not saying it's for every organization, but in general, it doesn't seem to be an issue now. You know, the C-level, they get cyber risk. And it's very difficult not to understand and appreciate why it is important, because, you know, your competitors, their peers, you know, may have been hit by a cyber attack. And if it's a targeted and successful cyber attack, you know, the damage can be quite considerable. So that's one of the first things. You know, the board, if you like, now understand cybersecurity and its position, and I think they also appreciate the fact that, you know, cyber risk, it's kind of interwoven with so many other risk disciplines. You look at IT risk, you look at operational risk. You know, that cyber risk element, which used to be a very small dot on the risk radar, is really quite significant now. I think also the impact to brand, it's becoming very clear, and there's lots of good, you know, academic papers out there that have highlighted, you know, the impact it has on share price. But most importantly, you know, if you look at share price for a number of large organizations that have been hit by a cyber attack, they tend to bounce back pretty quickly. But what doesn't change so much is the volatility of the stock, and that's really important, because that will influence whether, you know, big investors will take a chance on investing on a volatile stock. You know, and these are all business elements that are key to the C-level individuals. This is what they will be looking at. And so if you can translate that in terms of cyber risk and cybersecurity and why it's important for the business to accept and take a much more ownership of cybersecurity, then you kind of, you know, you're helping to sort of help highlight that to senior management. And I think the other thing that we're seeing here in terms of the role of the CISO, so the Chief Information Security Officer, which, you know, may also be called Director of Cybersecurity or Information Security, the role in terms of the reporting lines, we're seeing change. So, and I've experienced this myself, you know, in previous roles where we've seen reporting into the CIO shift to reporting over into legal. You know, and we're seeing that more and more now. Now, typically you would have, you know, dotted lines into the CIO and maybe a dotted line into the Chief Risk Officer, but there's a clear reporting line both into IT and into the business. I think the other trend that we're seeing, one which I find very favorable, is transparency. You know, when organizations, you know, tend to get hit by a cyber attack, they're more likely now to be, you know, transparent about the extent to which the attack has impacted their information or information of their clients. And there've been some real great examples from organizations. Maersk Shipping Line, for example, Norsk Hydro, I think these have been, commendable in terms of the way the businesses, when they've been hit by these attacks, which of course is all in the public domain, they've rolled out the CEO to talk about, what they're doing to be able to minimize it. And I think there's a big lesson learned that a lot of organizations can take from that. So there's some real, from my side, there's some real positive movements. Obviously there is some, some negative sides in terms of trends that we're seeing. And I think, the key one today that we're seeing is, an increase in attacks and exploiting these global events that we're seeing, like COVID-19. So, we're seeing an increase in phishing related attacks. We're seeing, technologies like webinars, Zoom, GoToMeeting, VPNs. These are all technologies I'm sure that people now are going to be highly dependent on, that may become, a target for hackers to attack. But of course, with the workforce increasingly working from home now because of COVID-19, that's also going to be putting quite a strain on access control systems and the infrastructure in general.
Nick, I think that's great. There's two things I think you've mentioned out of in these points that you've listed that are key. One of them is the change in the CISO role itself. I've read multiple stories lately, as I'm sure lots that are on the webinar have as well, of the CISO role changing, and it's becoming even one of the highest valued roles within organizations today, and one of the highest pay roles potentially within organizations as well. Sometimes directly reporting to the C-levels, sometimes directly reporting with a side to the board as well. Have you seen that also?
Yeah, I have. And, there can be some real success stories there, and also some failures. One of the things that I think a CISO has to be slightly wary of is, whilst you may get this, excessive amount of attention, if you like, from senior management, it's quite a different ball game than they may, been previously used to. I've seen a number of CISOs, struggle to kind of translate, if you like, or integrate well with the board, because at that level, they have a different nose for risk, if you like. So although we try our best to, simplify the language of cybersecurity, sometimes it just doesn't get communicated clearly enough to the board level. But where I see organizations or a CISO that does struggle with that, but has made it a successful a sort of project, if you like, is to engage with someone who can champion their cause, and I've seen a number of roles, especially in legal, that can act as that kind of interface, if you like, between the CISO and the board. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The CISO role is becoming much more visible within the organization. It has to be. But there's, it's more of a, you've got to be careful about, how quickly you sort of rise up the ranks within the organization. So looking for additional support to help your cause is probably a good sort of hint to adopt.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. And I think in the ever-changing environment that we're in today, that makes great sense. And these roles becoming so high profile so quickly, that's absolutely great advice. Given the dynamic changes of the security landscape itself, what do organizations need to do to adopt for establishing, the foundations of cyber risk approaches in general?
Yeah, sure. And it's a good question. I'm going to come on to that now. Here we go. So, well, let's take a step back first. One of the things I want to do is just to, take a look at what we mean by, typical compliance-led approaches. And of course, I'm going to be fairly general here before we get into the risk-based approach. But when we talk about compliance-based approaches, we are talking about looking at how well an organization aligns to could be an internal policy, which could be linked to regulations in your industry, and that has to be, we're not saying that you replace your compliance-based approach with a risk-based approach, but more about adopting a more risk-based approach to cybersecurity. So I can come on to those here, if that's okay, or unless you want to do this poll, actually, Greg.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go ahead and do the poll. Let's try into poll number 2. And so our apologies for the first poll there. Let's try poll number 2, and you should see it popping up now. And if not, we'll list out the questions in the chat as well for everyone that does not see this pop up. But the question is, how risk-oriented is your cybersecurity team? 100% compliance, 0% risk. 75% compliance, 25% risk, 50% compliance, 50% risk, 0% compliance, 100% risk. And so if you could answer that, we'll get a view of everyone's results in just a moment. And again, we've placed that question in the chat as well. So if you're not able to see the poll.
Great. It looks like this time we're getting lots more responses through the Zoom console. So thank you so much, everyone, for bearing with us. It seems like some of the polling functions are a bit lagging in Zoom today. So thank you. Again, if you can't answer the poll with the polling pop-up, feel free to send them over in Q&A or through the chat. I'm going to end the poll now and share the results.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So we have, looks like we have the leader is 52% at questions, or option C, which was 50% compliance, 50% risk. So that's interesting, Nick.
Yeah.
And,
that for me, that's good, because, hopefully hopefully we can help sort of move that line further up. But no, that's pretty much what I'd expect. The biggest bulk of organizations, they're doing a bit of both in those areas. I mean, compliance has to be, as a mainstay. It's not going to go away, but it's pleasing to see more organizations adopting risk. I think, in my experience, if we would do that poll 5 years ago, it would look very different. So that's a really good
absolutely
sign. Okay, so let's go into that question that you were talking about there, Greg, in terms of some of the ideas around what cyber risk fundamentals should look like. So let's first start off with what we're talking about, a compliance-based approach, and of course this is compliance-based approach for cybersecurity. So there are a number of inputs into your compliance-based approach. Of course, you'll have your own policies. There might be some industry standards. There's obviously regulations and legislation, of course, that you can't sort of hide from. But this ultimately all comes into a compliance-based approach, and the way you obviously look at compliance-based approach to security is you want to see how well aligned you are to that. So organizations may take a lot of these external standards and legal and regulatory mandates and craft their own sort of information security policy or policies. And then you would assess yourself against those. And of course, they would vary from country to country, depending on the size of the organization. But largely, it provides a kind of a baseline set of controls. And, you'd have your audit teams that would go along and understand to the extent to which your a particular part of the business or system or the enterprise as a whole is complying to those controls and rules. So that's the compliance-based approach here. And of course, what that provides you is a clear indication in terms of the extent to which you're aligned and meeting those compliance requirements. And that's the same for cybersecurity. That's the same for, looking at compliance alignment to, it could be accountancy, it could be legal, a range of different functions across the business. And there are some really key benefits with the compliance-led approach. it's a consistent approach. It's fairly straightforward and easy to follow. It's well adopted in a number of key areas. And it works well, as I say, typically in a static environment where you don't have a great deal of change, and that's important. It is a function that does work well in a fairly static environment. But the challenge that we have in cybersecurity is it's anything but static. So there are sort of limitations, and you either have a number of options here. One is you can provide almost like real-time standards and policies, which of course is a significant undertaking for organizations. If you do adopt a compliance-led approach for cybersecurity, one of the key, I suppose, areas that we see is often an over-engineering of controls. So organizations tend to be spending a lot more money where necessary on securing, maybe systems, the data, because there may not necessarily be the risk associated with that control. So this is where, you do see some benefits of a compliance-led approach for certain areas, certain functions of business. But when it comes to cybersecurity, the risk-based approach is becoming much more important for being able to provide a much more dynamic approach to your security program and how you protect your organization. So let's take a look at the risk-based approach for cybersecurity. And this is, this is a fairly high level 30,000 view of how you would adopt a risk-based approach here. But there's some subtle sort of attributes in each of these I don't think that we always, take into account. So when you're establishing your risk profile, this is not just a case of looking at what we perceive to be the, prioritized risks to our organization. It's important to look at the type of features of your business as well. If you, I don't know, if you do work for defense contractors, you may come under the, the sights of nation states. If you start, mentioning about, an acquisition of a company that holds a lot of, medical data or personal data, there are certain announcements organizations tend to make that, that are the right announcements from a business perspective. But unfortunately, there's another side to that. There's the, nefarious community that will be watching out and doing their own risk assessments of your organization. So, and that can often give them a level of intelligence to spot some weaknesses that could then be exploited. So when we talk about the risk profile, we need to look at it from a business context. I know that's a bit of a cliche and everyone talks about that, but when you break down and unpack, the elements of your organization, some of those will influence, the risk profile. I mean, you could be, I don't know, you could be in an oil and gas industry and you could be announcing a new find or a new area where you're going to start drilling, which will, raise the interest of hacktivism. So there are a number of actions organizations will naturally take that could cause, change in your risk profile. And of course, such actions are not going to stop. You're not going to sort of suggest to the business, no, we can't announce this, of course. But it's important for the cybersecurity group to understand that because they now need to know what changes could occur and what to look for. So that's talking about your risk profile here. The next step, of course, is, to determine your risk appetite. And this, in our experience, this is more of an art than a science. So I'm not going to try and say we've got the silver bullet to address this. We don't. And I don't think many people do have. Now, there are sort of techniques in which you can establish your risk appetite. You can look at breaking down your risk appetite for different impact categories or different risk categories, looking at what's our appetite for reputational damage, what's our appetite for financial impact. And that's important to have. And when you look at breaking that down, you might want to start understanding what the appetite is when you speak to the CFO or the chief operating officer. So different parts of the business can start to help shape a much more granular view of what that risk appetite is. The old approach of trying to put that line in a heat map, it just doesn't work. I mean, you're trying to get, 5 or 6 senior people in an organization to try and give you a position as to what risk appetite looks like or how to overlay risk appetite in a heat map. So we've got to be a little bit smarter and more business savvy about how we understand the risk appetite. And the importance of the risk appetite, of course, is it allows us to compare and contrast where there are risks fall within or outside of that risk appetite, which then obviously just helps you determine how you're going to respond, mitigate it, or accept it. But in addition to the risk profile, the risk appetite, you are also going to have your compliance obligations. So these are, if you like, non-negotiable. You look at GDPR, you look at your own industry sector are going to have their own regulations around how you protect your information, how you respond, what good practice looks like. So the combination of those have to be used as the input for designing your information security program or your information security strategy. So, but if you take that risk piece away, you get a significant loss in terms of direction for that information security program, which is why it's now fundamental for organizations to adopt.
Yeah, that's great. That's great information. So, let's talk about the benefits to the risk-based approach, in cybersecurity. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, number one, I think it's providing, well, not that I think, I know, it's providing a lot more transparency around the general risk picture for the organization. As I said earlier on, cyber risk is pretty much ingrained in other risk disciplines, and you have to consider all of these risk disciplines together. I mean, most people call it enterprise risk, but it's, it is important to consider how cyber risk could impact operational risk, how that could impact, financial risk. So number one, it's providing organizations much more informed and actionable data, greater levels of transparency around the organization as well. The other benefit that we see here is a much more objective view as to where investment should take place for cybersecurity. And for me, that is probably one of the most important areas. I know from my own experience that when you try to present, a project or program of work, and if it's not backed up by a clear understanding of the potential risks that could occur or exposure that could occur if that investment and controls doesn't take place, it becomes a very difficult argument to have, because what you're effectively suggesting to the business is, we understand what the cyber risks and the level of exposure to those risks are. These are the types of impacts that can occur and consequences to the organization. These are the mitigating actions. Now, what do you want to do? Do you want to accept it? Do you want to mitigate some of it? Or do you want to, to reduce the risk to a much more manageable level? So it's really around that more informed direction. And the thing to highlight here, again, cyber risk assessment, cyber risk management, it is still subjective. We are getting better at making much more, objective decisions, but it's providing, and you're helping to provide, better informed information about those risks and what can be done about them.
Yeah, I think that's great. One thing to note also, I think that's key, and you and I have discussed this as well a couple of times, is that risks today are being identified and they're changing at a much faster rate than they ever have before. They're changing much faster than compliance frameworks, much faster than regulations could possibly keep pace with. With that being said, the business is having to become more flexible in their approach to cyber risks, and perhaps we could discuss that for a moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a changing landscape, but from my perspective, I think that what we've been looking for in the cybersecurity functions for really quite some time is a really strong rationale, a really strong argument that helps to validate why you're putting forward these suggestions. And as I say, the business, they get risk, most C-level individuals have a good nose for risk, but that nose for risk, if you like, has been developed from their 30, 20 years experience in their industry sector and the organization. So they know what risk looks like. The cyber risk piece is really the new kid on the block. And so CISOs have been struggling to try and, articulate that to an audience that haven't had that number of years of exposure. So it's a really tough gig to be able to sell. But if you go through this sort of level of critical thinking and rigor for when you're assessing risk to your data assets, your key systems, keep these key business services running, that can be very powerful to explain to the business, because you can talk about some of the technical aspects of those risks, but ultimately you can articulate that in terms of business consequence. And so that is something that we see as a success factor we're seeing more and more of. And it might even be fair to say that, somebody said to me this morning, what do you think the future of, security, professionals is? And I sometimes think that, it's easier to train business analysts in cybersecurity than it is easier to train cybersecurity, graduates in the business. You still need your cybersecurity graduates because, there's a real technical skill set that we're desperately need. But for more senior individuals, that knowledge and business acumen is the vehicle that we need to enable and integrate cybersecurity well within the business.
That's an important point. And having a business mindset is key in understanding the cyber risks as well. The cyber risks, the attackers, the APTs, they're changing their process. They're utilizing advanced business analytics type tools, techniques, things that business analysts and other business representatives are using as well, but they're using them against us. And I think it's important. That's an important point that you made there, that the business can take different approaches than they may even be considering today by utilizing business analysts and things, other tools like that, and getting more value.
Yeah.
There are less, to your point, and part of your point was as well, that there are less cybersecurity individuals in the market today, and the need for them is growing while the number of them is less. And those numbers don't seem to be coming together anytime soon, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some people talk about a skills gap, and I'd say that's more like a skills chasm. It is an area. I mean, it's a blessing if you're in cybersecurity. Let's be honest. It's a very interesting area to be in. You're in demand, but looking at the bigger picture, it's an area that needs more people, more skilled people. So you're right.
So at a high level, what are the practical fundamentals that we need to be aware of when we're proposing a risk-based approach to our senior management?
Sure. Absolutely. So when we are initiating our cyber risk, information risk programs of work, there's a couple of realization factors that I've learned along the way. The first is, whatever cyber risk assessment, information risk assessment methodology, and GRC product that you're using, what's key to realize in my experience is you're never going to mitigate all those risks. So, and it's pointless going to the business or the stakeholders and telling them that's what you intend to do, because they're probably going to look at you in a fairly unfavorable manner because the cost associated with it and the amount of disruption. So again, we have to be able to prioritize those risks. And I'll come to how you prioritize those risks a bit later, because it's not just about what risk appears at the top, although that is obviously going to have a big weight to it. The next is then providing, the business with the options here. And what I mean by that is, when you present your risks from your risk assessments, it could be on a key system, a key application. You could be looking at doing a risk assessment of a supplier or a data center. What's important is when you look at your mitigating strategy is that you provide them with a number of options here. So you don't go in with the platinum level option to reduce risk to, minimal level. You look at a range of different factors that need to come into place. But also be aware that the organization may accept the risk. And that is okay to do in my book, but also be careful in terms of the level of risk that may be accepting. And this is where you need some kind of escalation process. What you don't want to happen here, and what we see quite often is, the business wanting to get a key system or service to market, and the culture may be one of just get it to market, accept all the risk. You need some kind of escalation process in there, whether that's a steering committee with senior people on there to make those judgments. You're not making those judgments as a risk practitioner, so that's, I suppose, a saving grace to some extent. Our job as risk practitioners in cybersecurity is to facilitate these meetings and to advise as much as we can. The final decision, whether they mitigate or accept, comes down to the stakeholders. But you need some checks and balances in place there, because, it's not uncommon for business leaders to accept on, high levels of risk to deliver a service. But the third point here then is really around collaboration. And I think this is, a number of lessons that I've learned myself and a number of members of CRMG and, in senior cybersecurity roles, is this collaboration piece, because we can go in there with, this is the art of the possible, and this will help you reduce the risk. And these are the options to put in place. But a much broader understanding around, obviously the cost element always comes into play. The complexity, the amount of disruption a suggested control may cause the organization. I used to nearly always get asked the question, not about cost, but what's the experience of the end user? Is there more accountability on their behalf? What's the amount of training we need to do? And these are all sort of, facets of the business that need to be appreciated in security before you put forward. So whatever mitigating strategy you put in place, these, list here on the far right-hand side, they're just examples, but it's not a bad idea to think through and present these to the stakeholders as well.
That's great. I have one question for you, Nick, and then I think I'll ask one question that's come up in our Q&A section, because I think it's a great question. My first question to you about this is, what about if a business manager, and I think you know where we're going with this. What about if a business manager decides to accept all risks? I'll throw that question out there.
Yeah, good question. And it's not the first time I've heard it or seen it myself. Well, it depends what you've got in place.
Right.
Our advice is to put in some kind of steering committee pretty quickly, if you don't have one, whereby you report these risks. So there may be one that already exists, and I wouldn't be surprised. In my experience, there is typically a risk committee of sorts. I should imagine that because of the ramifications around a lot of privacy legislation fairly recently, like the GDPR, that there will be elements, if you like, of an audit or a risk committee that already exists in your organization. And if cybersecurity is represented in those committees, well, it certainly should be. And if you are concerned about stakeholders accepting too much risk to rush an IT product or service to the market, then that should be, the committee to report to. There's a question around, and I've heard this before, would I be considered to be a whistleblower? I don't think you are. I think you're taking, the broader accountability of an organization. And the reason that's important, that accountability, is, it's not going to be uncommon in 5-10 years' time for organizations to disappear as a result of a major cyber attack. So, it's a very important thing to be able to report and ensure people don't take unacceptable levels of risk.
Great. That's great. So I have one question from Tim, and he says this: as we work to mature our cybersecurity programs within a changing threat and regulatory landscape, how do we approach the balance between policies that may be more aspirational right now and the lagging but improving practices?
Yeah, that's a a somewhat of a concern. I think, so my view on that, and it's not uncommon for people or for companies to put forward a policy or policies that are not achievable. Okay, so there's a couple of key points here. Number one, I think you need to be careful. I don't know, if Tim, if you're operating in a regulatory environment, or if it's highly regulated, should I say, because the regulators will pick up that point. They'll say, well, you're saying this in your policies, and there's no evidence you're doing this. So I think there has to be an element of balancing that difference between those aspirational policies and actually what's happening on the ground. I think the key thing there is, I don't know how you've designed your policies, but again, and I'll come to this in a slide later on. Again, your policies should be designed to be able to mitigate against your risks. So, you shouldn't be having your policy saying one thing and your risk mitigation strategy saying another. My suggestion there is, is to start considering reviewing those policies and bringing them back down to a normal or more achievable level, because it's okay to stretch it a little bit, and I think that's absolutely fine to do, because policies tend to be produced with an idea of being updated in 2 years' time. That's usually the life cycle that we see at CRMG. And so if you can put forward a policy that is aspirational but can be achieved in 2 years, no problem, because at some point you're going to need to evidence it. You're going to be able to point to regulators, look, we're running a project on here. We will achieve this policy requirement. The other point I'd like to suggest here to Tim is you may want to grant, the organization a grace period. We used to do this in my previous role in PwC. We'd set a policy that was pushing the bar upwards, if you like, but there would always be a grace period for the organization to catch up, because you can't expect the organization to suddenly adopt two-factor authentication or threat intelligence or whatever it may be if the policy says so. These things take quite a bit of time. So hopefully that helped you a bit there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
All righty. So let's, I'm conscious of time here. So I'm going to jump into what good looks like. And again, this is an industry perspective. As Stephanie mentioned before, we've worked with hundreds of organizations. And so we've got a good sort of understanding in terms of what good looks like and, what pitfalls to avoid. So I spent a bit of time with the rest of the team at CRMG. I think our average age of experience at CRMG is probably about 25 or 30 years. So we've all been around the block a bit. And so what we've done is we've pulled together a couple of hints and tips here. I'm not going to go through them all. Probably what's also mentioning is that I think on the Galvanize website, maybe Stephanie can talk to this at the end, is we've put this in terms of a one-pager. So these are described in a bit more detail. But let me home in on a few of these points here. Firstly, focusing on your crown jewels, if you like, your critical systems, and they're the mission critical systems in your organization. That's important because they're the spots you could be doing risk assessments on. They're probably the obvious targets for accidental threats to occur, as well as intentional or adversarial threats to exploit. So if you're able to do some kind of triage, and that's useful to achieve, a useful way of doing triage is a business impact assessment. Business impact assessment is a great vehicle for linking the cybersecurity function and the business. But when you carry out your business impact assessment, you're looking at criticality from a business perspective. So you can start to understand what you think may be a critical system, but the business may have a different view. And it's important to get both of those views together. So focus on your critical systems first for when you're doing your risk assessments. Moving down the list here, let me see. Yes, I think the second point here, there are a lot of frameworks and a lot of tools out there that claim to be information risk focused. So I would be careful about ensuring that the fundamentals of risk. So what I mean by that are, your likelihood and your impact. So, there's a way of assessing threats, a way of assessing vulnerabilities, a way of assessing impacts. They're the fundamentals, and there's some really good standards out there. There's the ISO 27005, the ISF have their own IRAM 2. There's NIST. There's some great sort of practical, pragmatic standards that honor those fundamentals of risk. I think moving down the list here, there sometimes tends to be a lot of euphoria and excitement around adopting a cyber risk a process sometimes. And I see quite a lot of organizations, sort of attempt to boil the ocean. So you really need to take a bit of a phased approach here, because you don't want to expect the business to start, adopting your views and your concerns as quickly as you would. So a sort of a light approach, if you like, to understanding and profiling risk to key systems is a good way forward before you then start rolling out a program of work. So there's a few sort of hints and tips there. And central to establishing any cyber risk management capability is an assessment. I'm not going to go through each of these phases, but typically, you want to ensure that you've got a clear scope. So if you're looking at a framework, you're looking at a methodology to support your approach for establishing a cyber risk capability. There are a couple of key features. You want to establish a consistent approach. The last thing you want to do is have different groups around your company, carrying out their own version of cyber risk assessments. So you really want to establish one approach to doing cyber risk assessment, because at some point you might want to start aggregating these results. You might want to start generating an enterprise-wide risk view. And the last thing you want is a whole different use of terms. Your threat list in Germany differs from your threat list to the UK, to the Canada, to the US. So building in that consistency is important. And it should be based on something like this. You create and understand the scope, so you can determine what's in and out of scope. You look at the potential consequences of an impact, and that really should be a workshop with the business. You can develop your threat templates. You can assess your control weaknesses or vulnerabilities. They're all the key components that are needed to understand the risk. And then, of course, you look at mitigating the risk. And that goes back to the point earlier on. This is where you really need to engage the business to understand what is. One of the things I mentioned about threats, so getting back to the third phase, if you like, is broaden that threat list. There's adversarial threats all over the place, but you do want to consider the accidental threats, because they do occur. You might want to consider those environmental threats. Those threats are out of our control. We're in one right now. Who would have ever thought that 2 months ago, half the world would be working from home? So, these are threats that have to be considered as part of the cyber risk assessment. But that's the assessment piece. There are other key parts of a risk management, a broader management capability. Risk monitoring, for example. Look at your business triggers here. You may go through a merger and acquisition. You may have a system that suddenly, goes from 20,000 medical records to 200,000 medical records. You may grant access to that system to a third-party supplier. These are all triggers within the business or features that have changed that will alter the risk profile. So you need to revisit your risk assessments, on a basis based on those triggers. And not just on a timely basis that we often see. We quite often see people saying we do it every 2 years. Well, 2 years of a new system, that could change massively. You could double the size of the data, double the size of the user base, all of which would change. I think the last point around risk reporting, for me, that's vital. This is where I see, great processes, great methodologies suddenly fail, because your audience for receiving this risk information will vary. You'll obviously have your cybersecurity function. They'll want to understand what those technical risks are. Your IT teams will want to understand, tell me what controls I need to put in place so we can get the system and application into place and we can get it out into the market. And then, of course, you've got your stakeholders. How can you translate those risks into impacts? That's something that's meaningful for them. So risk reporting is not just a technical output. It has to look at the audience themselves. And just to sort of finish off here, I want to talk just briefly about the use of cyber risk as an output, because it should never be silo-based. It shouldn't just be geared towards helping to identify technical controls to put in place. Let's take, for example, insider attacks. We've just seen a poll there that indicates that, all of you listening here have a great concern around insider attacks. And I'm not surprised. It's something that we hear from our own clients. But, this is information that should be pushed up to other functions within the business, human resources. Maybe there's something there in terms of the HR policies that need to be put into place when you see, misdemeanors taking place in an organization. You may start to identify an increase in social engineering. So there's awareness and education that needs to take place. Or you might start to see an increasing compromise of suppliers. So you want to start building in, some kind of resilience into your contracts with your suppliers. But this is all information that you gain from your cyber risk assessments that can also start to shape your strategy. Right, so I'm on to the next part here, Greg. We're aware of time, so I'll hand the piece over to you today.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that we want to talk about was the importance of automation. I'm aware of the time as well, so I'll be quick about this. The importance of automation in cyber risk management is key to allowing this entire risk process that we have been discussing for the past, 50 minutes to be successful. And Nick literally just hit on a couple of the points there, but I'll make a couple quick points. The importance of automation in cyber risk management allows for a few things. Increased efficiency. It allows for better utilization of people, resources by streaming manual processes, things like incident reporting, business continuity, things like that with increased efficiency, reduced errors by automating processes, workflows, removing the human element, things like that, reduce risk through visibility into multiple systems, improved analytics and reporting. Many organizations have tools that collect tons of data, like Nick mentioned. By correlating that data, it allows for better reporting, not only for siloed issues, but of aggregate data that you have in multiple systems, and allowing for that you just be able to see trends of things occurring, not just in one system, but across multiple systems. And automation in cybersecurity risk management allows you to do that. Where one individual seeing one thing, those days have passed. We have to aggregate the data so that we can see what's happening across the entire organization and report that up to leadership and key individuals.
That's right. Great. Okay, so maybe I can just finish on a couple of key takeaways here.
Sorry, Nick. Before we do
Yes,
that, I just want to make sure for everyone here who's concerned about CPEs, if we could just quickly do the final poll, and then I'll let you continue with your key takeaways.
Go for it.
The poll is just launching now, and again, if you're unable to respond with the in-console polling features, I've posted the poll question in the chat as well.
Yes, so poll question number 3 is this: how do you feel about your current level of automation? It should be less, it should stay the same, or it should increase? I think we're seeing, even in the chat window, I think we're seeing a pretty clear response coming through that. We'll wait just a moment for that, the results to come up on that. Seems like the poll is delayed just a moment.
Okay, I will stop the poll now, and for anyone who hasn't had a chance to respond, in the console, just feel free to use chat or Q&A again. Thank you.
Okay, so overwhelmingly, Nick, 74% say it should increase. So that's good news.
Yeah, I just a quick comment on that. As we mentioned before, this idea of a real-time risk picture, with all of this rich data sort of, swimming around our organizations, tools like GRC products, they're primed and ready to go to start, aggregating that to make a sort of a semi-automated risk view. There'll always be the human element that should, take a role in deciding what that risks are, but we can get, to 60 or 70 miles an hour with this automation, definitely.
Definitely.
Okay, so I've left 3 takeaways here. I think the key one for me, if I'm honest with you, is if those of you who've listened to this, hopefully you've got a lot out of it. One of the things I would emphasize here is, start off by breaking down your risk program into chunks of work. It is a case of evolution rather than revolution, and it's not because of what you or your team can achieve. It's also about the willingness of the business to receive what you're producing, what you're presenting them with. So that's me, and a big thank you for listening to Greg and I. Stephanie, I think you wanted to talk to this slide.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick and Greg, for your fantastic presentation today. And thank you so much, everyone who was on the line who joined us today. So some of you may know that this is actually the first webinar in our Cyber Risk Management webinar series. So the next session is going to be on April 23rd about getting inside the mind of the board. So the link will be shared with you following the webinar, as well as with a copy of the recording and slides. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll join us again. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.